time for lesson 10 and the moment you've all been waiting for. We get to the Bible's craziest book, the book of Revelation. And I remember the first time I read the book of Revelation. I read it as a child. I think I was 12, 13 years old, and I read it through all in one sitting. It doesn't take very long. You just sit down and read it all the way through. And if I'm going to understand this, I want to know what it's about. Started in verse 1, read to the end, and didn't understand it. I'm now much older, and I've read it a few times since, and I still say, I'm not sure I get all that. But I think there's parts of it that can be very helpful to us. All of it's helpful. It's just some of it's very difficult. Well, we're going to try today. The first thing I'm going to do is talk about the different views people have on Revelation. And I'm going to tell you up front what my view is and kind of how we're working through this. But I'll give you about 5 different views that people take so you know kind of what's going on and where the debate is. The first view is sometimes called the preterist view. Preterists believe that most, maybe all, of Revelation relates to events which took place in the first century shortly after it was written. So the book of Revelation, at the earliest, it was written in the late 60s AD. At the latest, it's the late 90s AD. But general agreement, it's written in the second half of the first century, less than 50 years, let's say less than 60 years after Jesus died and was raised from the dead, right? It's in that same time period. So the preterist would say that's when these things happened. It all happened in the first century and people saw it happen. The historicist says, well, close, but not quite. Yes, some of those things started happening in the first century, but it actually tells the story of all of church history, that it's telling what would happen in the centuries to come. And so you don't want to just look at that time period. You want to look at the 2,000 years between then and now. And that's what the book of Revelation is about. The futurist position says most, if not all, of Revelation relates to things that still have not happened 2,000 years later. They'll happen just before the end of human history, which might be right now. Okay, the futurist, don't want to make fun of them. The futurist is always saying, and it's right now. And 50 years pass and they still say, and it's right now, right? So they're always kind of excited that it could be any second now, that it finally starts happening. They are right, I'll say. Some of the things in the book of Revelation still haven't happened. I believe that. But the futurist would say none of those things have happened, and in fact, we're still waiting for them. The idealist says, don't even worry about when it happens. That's not the point. It's not trying to tell you history or the future. It's trying to paint a big picture, that it's trying to show you the fight between good and evil. It's a struggle, and it's going to be true at all times. It was true in the first century. It's true today. It's just kind of like a general picture of the conflict between good and evil. Finally, fifth view is the eclectic point of view, and this is actually the view that I take. It's some of all those things. It's not any one of them. Quite a lot, the preterists are right, quite a lot of the things in the book of Revelation happened in the first century when these things were being written. And he's talking about current events at that time. The historicist is correct. Some of the things would kind of live on past that century and would happen in the years to come. The futurist is correct in that some of the things in the book of Revelation, like the resurrection of the dead, still haven't happened. The idealist is correct that the big picture of the book, even if you ignore the details, is that there's a battle between good and evil going on at all times, and God wins that battle. So I think you take all 4 of those points of view and kind of blend them in individual passages, and you get a good reading of the book of Revelation. And we're going to try to work through that today. Let me give you some guidelines that I use when reading the book. 3 big points. Number 1, the book of Revelation tells you when it would happen. By and large, it gives you a hint. I'll show you that in a second. Number 2, the book of Revelation tells you where some of it would happen. If you're wondering about geography, there's a pretty good tip-off in one verse that says, and this is what we're talking about. And then number 3, the book of Revelation tells you that it is written using figurative language. There's sometimes a debate. Is it figurative or literal? The book actually tells you that some of it is clearly figurative. In fact, most of it is clearly figurative. And the book tells you that. You don't have to guess. Let's get started. What about when it would happen? Here's about 4 verses, 2 at the beginning of the book, 2 in the last chapter of the book, tell you that in general, A lot of what was happening in the book of Revelation related to events at that time. Okay, very true. Verse 1 of chapter 1. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John. So at the time of John, there were some things that must soon take place. That's 1900 years ago, not today. So a lot of it had to do with what's going on right then. Verse 3, same point. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it, for the time is near. Again, 1900 years ago, John says that some of this is about to happen. At the end of the book, after he said everything he's going to say, chapter 22, verse 10, and he said to me, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near. That's actually a Daniel reference. Daniel was told, seal up the book, for the time is not yet. Daniel was speaking of things further off in history. John is being told, actually, you're about to see it right in front of your eyes. Don't bother sealing up that book. You need it right now. And then verse 20, he who testifies to these things says, surely I'm coming soon. Amen. Come, Lord Jesus. Like something that Jesus was talking about to happen right in front of their eyes. And he says, here I come. Okay. So without doubt, a fair bit of the book of Revelation relates to events in the first century context, because it goes out of its way 4 times to say, you need to know this, John, right now. And right now is 1900 years ago. So if you read the book of Revelation and you try to make all of it about things that we're waiting on today, you're missing the point that John is told, you need this right now. What did it mean for John 1900 years ago if it didn't happen till now in our time? So that's important. Number 2, where was it going to happen? Okay. This is debated, but I feel like it's a pretty strong point. In Revelation 11 and verse 8, it's talking about a time of destruction, and it says, their bodies will lie in the public square of the great city, which is figuratively called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. Where would some of these events happen? It would happen where the Lord was crucified. Okay, where was Jesus crucified? In Jerusalem. So at least some of the events of the book of Revelation relate to the city of Jerusalem. Has to, because he said that's where it would happen. That doesn't mean everything does, but at least some of it does. This, again, in my mind, connects this story to what we talked about last week in Matthew 24, when Jesus said the temple's going to fall, bad things are going to happen. AD 70, the temple is destroyed, the Romans siege the city. At least some of this relates to some of that. I'm not going to say everything. I don't think it's an all or nothing proposition, but at least some of it relates to that, because that's the connection in that verse. Third, how will the book of Revelation tell us this story? Is it literal? Is it figurative? Listen to verse 1 again. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant. 2 important words there about how God was going to give John the message. First, he's going to show it to him. It's interesting words, right? He's not going to tell it to him. Okay, right now I'm telling you things. I know you're looking at a screen, but you're mostly listening to my voice. My facial expressions are not really telling you the future of the world. You're listening to my voice. That's not what God says. He says, I'm going to show you. So point 1, John is going to be shown images. It's part of what makes the book of Revelation difficult, I think, for us, is that John's not telling us what God told him. John is telling us what God showed him. So imagine, you see this incredible vision and you're like, how do I communicate that? That's the book of Revelation. Is John trying to tell us what the Spirit showed him? It was an image, something he saw, a vision. But second, the words, he made it known. In the ESV, that's very vague, like he made it known. That could mean anything, right? I whispered it in his ear, I shouted it, I told him, I showed him. But I think there's a hint. The old King James translation says he signified it. And the word there, and this is from Vincent's Word Studies in the New Testament, is from sema, which is the Greek word for a sign. Hence, literally, give a sign or token. The word literally means I'm about to tell you something figurative. It's kind of silly, but that's what it means. The word is telling you I'm giving you an image, a sign, a representation of something, not the real thing. I'm giving you a representation of the real thing. And Vincent goes on to say the word is appropriate to the symbolic character of the revelation. And he says, compare this to the word as it's used in Revelation 12:1. So let's look at that. This is midway through the book. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. Okay, he calls that a sign. So John sees a vision, an image of a woman in the sky with a crown. Okay, so are we supposed to interpret that literally and say, well, I'm going to stand here and wait until I see the woman in the sky? Or is it, as he says, a sign? It's a symbol of something. So this is where we say, yeah, there's some symbolic representation here, and the text just tells you that blatantly. Some of the things that you see represent other things. And then you get an example of that kind of interpretation in chapter 1. Chapter 1 tells you this is a book that's meant to be interpreted, not just read literally. So look at, I'll give you little pieces here just for summary, but this is chapter 1, 12 through 20. On turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man. In his right hand, he held 7 stars. Okay, so that's what he saw. A man holding 7 stars around, surrounded by 7 lampstands. Okay. What did that mean? He goes on. As for the mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, probably menorahs, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches. The 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. So what does he say? He says, when you saw that vision, I know what you saw was a star, but the star meant this. It represented this. I know you saw a lampstand, a menorah, but what it represented was this. So that tells you, Jesus is telling you right up front, this is how to read this book. John, I'm going to show you a vision, but you need to know the vision will represent something else. Okay, it's symbolic. Outline for the book, just in case you want to read it, I'd encourage you. Read it all the way through in one sitting. It's a wild book. Great ride. But here's kind of the outline to get you through it. The first 3 chapters are considered the prologue, and it has messages for the audience, who are the 7 churches of Asia. It's written to very real churches in Asia Minor, in what we call now Turkey. And it's 3 chapters with messages very specific to them. He even calls them by name. To the church at Laodicea. Here's what I'm telling you. Okay. And then the weird stuff starts in chapter 4 with a throne room scene, and then it gets stranger from there. And I think there's 2 sets of visions. Chapters 4 through 11 is kind of the first set of visions. And it's the story of how Christ would be victorious over some enemy. Okay. And then in chapter 12, it seems to like change the picture. It's like we change channels. It's still metaphorical. It's still, ongoing story, but it seems like it kind of shifts focus a little bit. 12 through 21, I think, is the story of how the church would overcome its great enemy. And now you say, what's the difference between the enemy of Christ and the church? Not a lot, right? There's a lot of overlap, but it's like telling the same story from 2 points of view. One, I want to show you Christ victorious. And then it tells the same story with different symbols and says, now let me show you how the church is going to be victorious because Christ is victorious. So it's 2 sets of images laid next to each other. And then chapter 22, beginning about verse 6, is the epilogue where it says, everything you just saw is true. Everything you're about to experience has been told to you now. What's the crisis? What's the main problem in the book? I think there's 2 sets of symbols and 2 sets of problems. Okay, number 1, there was persecution from Jewish sources that happens in the early years of the church. We read about that in the book of Acts. When Jerusalem, remember we said some of that will relate to Jerusalem. When Jerusalem fell and the temple is destroyed, the threat from Jewish persecution diminishes quickly. Okay, so I think the first set of symbols is Jesus Christ will be triumphant over the world that crucified him, over the influence of the people that were persecuting his church earliest. The Jewish people who held out against their own Messiah. Most of the early church was Jewish, but some, of course, opposed and were violent. Christ is going to overcome that. And I think that's the first set of symbols. John, don't worry about that. That's getting taken care of. Second set of symbols is kind of shifting your gaze somewhere else and saying, but there's still trouble. When the Christians stopped being persecuted by Jewish sources, they started being persecuted by Roman sources. Okay? And it would last much longer. But the church would still survive. Okay? I think that's the two messages. You're going to get persecution from over here, they're going to lose. Now you're going to get persecution from over here, it'll take a while, they're going to lose. Christians win. The main theme of the book is chapter 2, verse 10. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Yeah, there's going to be, the 10-day thing, I think, is again a symbol. There's going to be short periods of persecution throughout the whole history of the church. I think there's two in mind here. First, the Jewish, and then the Roman persecution. But after Rome falls, there's other people that'll persecute Christians. There are people persecuting Christians in the world today. And what Christ is saying, when those moments of persecution happen, know that they won't last forever, that Christ wins in the end. And so, as I've heard another minister say about this book, here's the main message of the book of Revelation. Christ wins. Pick a side. Don't be stupid. The book is telling you the winner before the battle's fought. So who are you going to be faithful to? When the enemy rears its head, it's going to look like they're really doing well, and you're going to be tempted to go over to the enemy. Christ says, I'm going to win, so pick your side. Don't be stupid. Be faithful, even if it costs you your life. And that's the overall message. Next week, we'll talk about a specific issue, the question of the beasts later in the second half of the book, and the mark of the beast and what that might mean for us.